Hello, I'm John Kerski. I work for a service-disabled veteran-owned small business here outside of DC. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is automated testing with Git integration and DAX Query View. So with that, this is the kind of about me. I've been working in the Power BI ecosystem for about the last 11 years. And a lot of where I come from in terms of the presentations I do on testing, and that comes from my project management background and leading project management teams. So if you hear some of these anecdotes that I have, it's usually from the perspective of a project manager. My contact information is in the bottom left there. And the slides for today's presentation, you can take a QR code, you can take a screenshot of that. I'm sure on the recordings that will be shared, you'll also be able to get them as well. Any of the code that I share today is under MIT license, so you're free to use. Just make sure that if it's for your company, if you're bringing in outside source code, you're following their policies. All right, so the agenda today, we're going to talk about why should we be testing in Power BI, talk a little bit about a pattern called the DAX Query View pattern and go into how to set that up. And then if we have some time, I'll show you some demos on how to take that testing and automate it so that when you make changes to your semantic model, it gets tested automatically through Azure DevOps and gets pushed to the cloud. All right, so why should we test? So the first thing is we always want to find errors before our customers do. I could tell you just from my personal experience that when a customer has to tell me that there's an error in the product, it doesn't reflect well on your project. If you find an error, you notify a customer and then give them a time frame in which you expect to fix it, you build a lot more trust with that customer. The other reason why you should test is you never want to see that same error in production again if you can avoid it. And I can tell you, you lose a lot of trust with customers if they see an error, they let you know about it, and then a week later or even like a month later, it shows up again, like a bad filter or some missing data or old data, and it just degrades at the trust level that you have with the products that you build. And then the third bullet in terms of why we should test is tests serve as the safety net. I'm sure many of you may have inherited a semantic model or a data set, and you are told that you got to make a change to that. And then you make that change and you hit that publish button and you just kind of close your eyes and just hope that you didn't break something. That's not a good feeling for anybody on your team. And when you don't have testing in place, it's harder for you as an individual to try to move on to different things because you're constantly having to babysit your semantic models that you've built in the past. And the new team members who are joining don't have that sense of security that if they make a change, they're not introducing some sort of regression error into the production environment. And this kind of dovetails into a larger topic, which I won't go into today, but if you're interested, testing is a big part of the DataOps concept. If you're interested, there's a video I have that kind of goes into a DataOps 101 about it, but testing is a important piece to DataOps. All right, so how do we test in Power BI? Well, thankfully, in the recent months, there's been a new product called the DAX Query View that was added to Power BI Desktop that makes it a lot easier. So the QR code I have on the screen here goes to a GitHub site that walks through this pattern, but I want to show you today what that pattern looks like. Now, before we get started, in terms of looking at this testing pattern, we have some prerequisites. You have the DAX Query View, which you'll need to make sure you're on the latest version of Power BI Desktop. It went generally available, so for those of you who are using like a June, July release of Power BI Desktop, it's just going to show up by default. If you're still between like November of last year and like May, you'll have to turn it on in preview features. The other part of this testing pattern requires you to use the Power BI project format, which is a new format that breaks out the Power BI files into text files. And I'll show you what that looks like. And 3, 4, and 5 are some outside tools that I would recommend having as part of the testing pattern. Azure DevOps, because we need to check in the code somewhere. Visual Studio, because it's a lot easier to explore the contents. And then PowerShell Core, which I'm going to show you. There's a trick that you can use to run through multiple tests in a very short amount of time. All right, so before I kind of switch over to another screen and show you the individuals, I always like to show a picture so you can kind of see it in your mind where each of these demo components that I'm going to show you fit. So if you look from left to right on your screen, imagine that you're working with Power BI Desktop and Visual Studio Code. If you save your files to the Power BI project format, it saves it in a bunch of folders. And then with Visual Studio Code, you can commit that to Git, and all those test cases are going to sit, and you can sync that with the Power BI service. All right, so I'm going to switch screens here, and you should see a Power BI desktop file. This is just a sample model. I share it on my GitHub site. It's nothing fancy. It's pulling in some data from a 538 website about comic book characters and when they appeared. So fairly straightforward data set, but I use it in a lot of my demonstrations. So we've got a fact table here, and I'll show you just what it looks like. We've got a fact table, and we got a couple dimensions in that model. Now, when you're working with the model here, one of the coolest things you can do now is use DAX Query View. So if you're not familiar with that, this is a new button that appears right below the modeling view. Again, this is something that appears by default now in like the June, July release of Power BI Desktop. If you're on an older version, you may need to go into preview features to turn that on. So when I click on this, you get a screen that will present to you a way to run your DAX queries. Now, a lot of the times they'll start off with maybe looking at your first model. So what's nice is if I run the query, it will actually pull the data here, and you have this DAX formula that you can run. And then you can also right-click on that model here on a table and have these quick queries where maybe I want to show the column statistics. And if I run that, it actually it writes a bunch of DAX for me that gives me some statistics about the model. Now, this is really important because you can leverage this information to help build your tests, because maybe you want to make sure that anytime you're working with a certain column, it's always distinct. There isn't any duplicates. The DAX here we can use to help generate those tests. And those tests have to follow a certain format. Now, I've got an example up here on the screen, and I'm going to zoom in here. So anytime we're building a test in using this pattern, you're going to have a row, which is a DAX formula for actually just creating one row in a table output. DAX always likes to return tables of data. So that row follows a standard schema. And if you can follow that standard schema, we can make sure that our testing is consistent, but we can also look at automating that in the future, because if the schema is consistent, it's easy to automate. So this schema has a test name, and you can write out probably as long as you want, but I would recommend keep it around 255 characters, what exactly you're testing, the expected value, and the actual value. And then you can chain that together with other tests. And you'll notice at the bottom here that I've named the tests with a suffix called .test. And this is important because if we have a standard naming convention for our test files, we can make sure in automation that we're always picking up something that ends in .test. And with DAX Query View, you may have a set of tests. You may have another tab that you're just using as a working area, and that's not really a test case, it's just your workbench. So this is a good way to kind of keep your testing features or your test cases separate from your other DAX that you're working on. So as you'll notice here, there's a bunch of test cases, and at the end, what it does is it's going to add one more column that just compares to see if the actual value is equal to the expected value. And so when I run this test, it is actually running through all these measures I have in the data model and making sure that those tests match the expected outcome. Now, for many of you who are working with models, we're working with live data and we're refreshing that data quite often. So one of the recommendations I have with this DAX Query View pattern is if you're testing your measures or testing anything that could be dynamic, try to time box or work with a subset of the data in your development environment. And so an easy example is like if you're working for a financial organization or you're working with financial data, usually there's some sort of fiscal year that you can bound a measure and make sure that like a DAX measure for revenue always equals $1 million or £1 million, depending on your currency for that fiscal year. And if that number were to change, in your test case would say, well, it's not 1 million, what's the problem? If the problem in this case is you've changed your Power Query or you've changed your DAX that has a negative effect, you'll know in the test case. And if the underlying data is static or stable, you know that the only variables that are changing in your test cases is somebody made a change to Power Query and it had an adverse effect, or somebody had a change in the DAX and it had an adverse effect. And then you can explore why that test case suddenly failed. And this is also a good time to mention that testing isn't something where you need to test every single aspect of your semantic model. What I usually recommend to teams that are adopting testing is what are the problem child, so to speak, of your model. Build tests for that. And as tests or errors in your system come up, think about what kind of tests you can bring into your system in order to avoid having that issue end up in production again. And then over time, you'll build a test suite that serves as your safety net. All right, so this is an example of testing measures. I also have some examples of testing columns. And in this case, I've got where I just want to make sure that certain calculated columns are matching the expectations under certain filters and formatted correctly. And then I have one of my favorite ones is the table tests. So this is just testing to make sure that the percentage of null values doesn't meet some sort of threshold. You can imagine that if you're working with some data sources that you don't necessarily control, a lot of the times maybe you're comfortable with maybe a certain percentage of that columns that you get in your model is going to have a null for an attribute. But if that goes from maybe 10% to 20% overnight, you might want to flag that or even fail the test so that you can investigate what's going on with that data that's causing it to have an increase in null values. And a lot of the times what I recommend folks to do is, for many of you, where we're looking at this DAX here going, I don't really want to write a lot of this. If I can kind of understand how to write the row and the test name and the expected value, but how do I know that's the right way to write that DAX? Well, there's a couple ways that I like to cheat, so to speak, on building those test cases. And the first is you can open a new tab on your report, and I like to use the card visual. And so if I'm testing a measure, I can actually bring over a measure here, which I have in my model, add some filters to it, So under the certain condition, maybe I want to time bound it. Maybe I want to add a couple of different filters to just test the different logic paths in DAX. And then I will just pull up the performance analyzer, start recording, and refresh the visual. And what's cool about it is that card, I could copy that query, or I can run that query directly in DAX Query View. So if I click on that, this will open a new tab up. I can run that, and that same card visual that I saw, that number is defined for me in DAX. And then I can just bring that DAX over to my test schema and incorporate that into the test suite. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it, which I showed a little bit earlier, but I'll recap there, is using the column statistics. If you click on the column statistics, you can get a set of statistics for each column in that table. And so if you want to make sure that the count matches the distinct values, meaning there isn't duplicates, you can just pull over those two DAX formulas and compare them in expected or actual value. You can also look at min-max if you want to make sure that your columns are in a certain range. You can do that. You can also check to see the null counts as well in these other tables. So there's a lot of helpers within Power BI Desktop so that you don't have to necessarily write the DAX yourself, especially if you're not a DAX expert. I'm not a DAX expert, but you can leverage a tool that is building quality DAX and put it into your test cases. All right, so you have your test cases. Let's say you have them built. One of the other things you can do with test cases is test for your schemas, because we want to test our measures, we want to test our columns, we want to test our table for the shape of the table, making sure there's no null records or there is records in there. I can't tell you how many times I'll accidentally add a filter to Power Query, and maybe I've filtered out a big portion of my table, and right before I move to production, I can run the test to make sure that that I've got all the values I should be expecting in a column, and I've realized I've accidentally left a filter in Power Query. The other thing you can test right before you move something to production is you want to make sure you have a snapshot of the schema. And I've got some examples here on how you can test the schemas using some cool functions that were recently introduced, which is the info function. And when I run this, what it will do is compare the existing schema with an expected schema on the table. Now, why would we want to test schema? Well, if you've ever had somebody accidentally change the type of a column or change a name of a measure, you may have had an issue where the relationship between two tables acts weird, and then the DAX formulas are thrown off. Or if you accidentally change the name of a measure, a report that is connected to your semantic model suddenly has the broken visual or the gray box of death. Those are things you want to avoid. And they're very easy mistakes to make, especially if you have somebody who doesn't necessarily know that making a rename causes a downstream effect in the semantic model to affect your reports. This is kind of a nice little safety mechanism to avoid those mistakes that are really apparent to a lot of folks. Because if you change a name in a measure and it breaks visuals, that's a very visual representation of some poor development practices or deployment processes with your project. So what this test will do is compare the current schema with a snapshot of the schema here. So you'll notice that there's a lot of DAX here, but this is the representation of that table in DAX. And if I run this, it will tell me if it's false. That tells me that the schema is slightly changed and I need to investigate it. Now, if you're looking at this DAX going, I don't want to write all this stuff for the columns, In the example I give in my GitHub site, there is an example file that will actually generate this DAX for you. And all it does is you can point it to your different table. So I point it to alignment dim, and it actually writes out the DAX for that data table. So you can use this and bring it over to your schema tests and not have to write that whole DAX out to represent what your model should represent. And so the schema tests are really important. I usually recommend that when your model's in production ready shape, that you add this test to your suite, because when you come back maybe a week later and have to make changes, or you're handed off to somebody else to make changes, if there's a change in a name or a change in a type, you'll know before you publish it to production that there's an issue. And if it's something that you expected, you just update the test case. If it's not something you expected, you can go and take a look at why the schema's changed and what things maybe you need to roll back. All right, so let's assume we build a bunch of test cases and we've got it in our semantic model. The nice thing about these test cases is they stay with the model. So all these tabs here down at the bottom stay with the Power BI desktop file that you're working with. And when you go to publish it, when you go to store this in Git version control, it stays with it as well. And so let me show you what I mean by that. So right now I have this file in the in PBIX format. You can actually save this as a PBIP file. And if you haven't done this already or explored PBIP, you have to click on Options and Settings and click on Options. And you'll get a preview feature that you'll want to turn on called the Power BI project file. Once you click on that, if this is the first time you're clicking that box, you're going to get asked to close Power BI Desktop and open it back up. So just a word of warning, save your work, click on that button, close Power BI Desktop, and then you can open back up, and then the PBIP format will be available for you to save. And when you do go to the Save As options, and if I go to Browse here, you're going to see there is a new format that shows up. We're all used to PBIX, and some of you may be familiar with PBIT, the template file. Power BI project files is the new format that shows up. Now, if I was to save that format and I save it, what you end up getting is a folder that looks something like this. You're going to get the Power BI PBIP file here, and this is kind of like a shortcut to your Power BI desktop opening up and loading your model and your report. But you'll also get these semantic model and report folders, and I'm going to drill into the semantic model folder here. You're going to get also a listing of the definition that defines your model, which is in the .bim file, as well as a folder for your DAX queries. And if I drill into that, you're going to see this should look a little familiar. Every tab in your Power BI desktop in DAX Query View is its own separate DAX file. Now, the beauty of that is if you have all those DAX files sitting in there, we can actually run those tests in an automated fashion as well. And so let me walk through a little bit about how that setup looks like. So I'm going to have a example Azure DevOps project here. And if I go to my repos, so I've set up a Cool Runnings 2024 repo that's blank. If I clone and do a clone in VS Code, I usually get this pop-up that says, hey, do you want to open it up for the first time? And I'm going to want to select my repository that I want to save my folder in. And what it's going to do is it's going to clone the repository that's sitting out here, and I'm going to open in a new window. And you're going to see that all I get is a README file. And so let's say I've set up my my repository, I've cloned it to my local machine. Now I want to save my Power BI file in the new PBIP format to this folder because I want to sync it up to version control. So if I hit save and I go here, you'll see we've got some new files here in Visual Studio Code. Now, this is, if you're not familiar with Visual Studio Code, you're going to get the source control button, and you got to make sure you have Git installed. A lot of libraries at this point require you to install Git, but Git's important to install. But you'll get this Git version control button here. If this is the first time you're using Visual Studio Code and you don't have Git installed, there's actually like a link to go install it within Visual Studio Code, which is nice. But this kind of keeps track of all your changes. And it has noticed that these are all new files here. One of the other things that it adds is a git ignore file. And just it's important to highlight that when you save in the PBIP format, it is, and you sync it to your repository, this git ignore tells Git not to load the data into your repository. And so this is really important for folks who work with row-level security, or you have to separate your development teams and only give them access to certain parts of the data. When you sync to your repository, it is only giving you the schematics of how the semantic model is set up, not including the data. So if you were to go to another machine, sync up and download the PBIP format from Git, when you open it up, you wouldn't have any data in it. You'd have to hit refresh. And so this is a really good point. This, from a security perspective, if you're talking to folks, the PBIP format doesn't put data in the cloud by default, and doesn't put it in your repositories by default, just the schemas, which is really a really good thing and a lovely feature that they've introduced. So once you have this in your repository, I can just show you again, you've got your DAX queries here, and I've got them all listed. And for those who are working with DAX, if I've got a bunch of tests here, notice I got to hit this run button. I got to hit this run button. Over time, you're not going to want to do that. You're not going to want to click on every single one and hit run, especially if you got a lot of test cases. And so I have a PowerShell module that you can install. It's free to install. This is how you would install it if you don't have admin rights. This is sitting out on the PowerShell gallery. It's open source. And what it will do is, if you have a semantic model open on your local machine and you're running it in Visual Studio Code, it will look for all your test cases in your DAX Query View and run them and tell you whether or not you've got any failed test cases. And let me, just to show you that I'm not lying here, I've got the model open up. I'm going to clear screen, and I'm going to do an invoke DQV testing. So I've already installed that module, and if I write invoke DQV testing and put a -local, what it's going to do now, hopefully if the demo gods are nice, is it will run through all the test cases and tell me which one it's running. So these are the test names, but if I go and zoom in here over on the right, you can see which DAX it's actually running. And if anything fails, you'll get the nice little red message. And at the bottom, you'll get a results on how many passed, how many failed, and your total test runs. And so the idea is, as you're working with your test cases or you're making updates to your model, if you're in Visual Studio Code, you just have to run this command and it will run through all your test cases. So even before you commit it to your repository, you can make sure that like nothing is broken or of like mitigate the risk that anything's broken. Usually what I advise folks to do is make sure that you run your refresh locally and then run these tests. But the nice thing is if you've got like 10 different tabs or 10 different test files, instead of having to click on each one of them, you can just run this line of code. It runs it and tells you whether or not your tests have passed or failed before you go and sync it up to the repository. So if I've got this model here and let's say the test cases pass. What's nice about this is if I can commit that. So let's say hypothetically I've run the test cases and I want to commit this to source control now. I can hit the commit button. Yes. All right. So one of the things you always have to remember when you're setting up your repository is you need to set up your user email if this is the first time. And you also need to set your username. So I already had this pre-saved. And now I should be able to commit. So the idea about Git is there's kind of, you commit locally. So you commit locally to the repository that's on your machine, and then you sync globally. And that will sync up to Azure DevOps or the repository you have in the cloud. And I know sometimes it takes this computer a little bit to try to figure that out. So what I will do is I'm going to close Visual Studio Code, open it back up, open up Cool Runnings. I should be able to commit it now since it's, oh, sorry everyone. I'm going to open that up one more time. There is one thing about Visual Studio Code that is sometimes vexing, is you need to put a commit message in. And sometimes it will hang if you don't put a commit message. So I'm going to put a commit message in, hit commit. Now I sync. And hopefully in a couple seconds, there we go. And if I go to the repository here, I'm on my main branch, hit refresh, and now that report and that semantic model is loaded up into the Azure DevOps service. And so now if I have it in my repository, I can then take advantage of Git integration to actually just have a workspace connect in Power BI connect to this repository. And so I've got a blank canvas here, a repository that's running Power BI Premium per user. This isn't even a Fabric instance, and it's important to point out, as long as you're running some premium capacity, Git integration is available to you. So you don't need to be on Fabric. You can be running Power BI Premium per user or Premium. And if you have that capacity assigned to that workspace, you can go into your workspace settings, and you'll see there is a Git integration button. And it will ask you to log into your organization. You can pick your project. You can pick your repository. So I picked the project. That's the repository. And you can even pick the branch. I only have one branch here for the demo. It's better to have multiple branches as you separate your workout from dev test to prod, but I'm just going to show you this for demo purposes. And then if I hit connect and sync, may take a couple seconds, but what it's going to do is connect to the Azure DevOps repo and sync up the report. You're going to see the semantic model show up, and then usually the report will follow right after it. And the first time you ever work with syncing this up, since the data is not in the repository, if I click on this report here, there's going to be nothing in here. And you'll see those gray boxes. What you need to do is refresh the data model. And as long as the data model is refreshed, that's completed. If I go back to the report, and I just need to hit Usually if I refresh it, there we go. Now the data's loaded in here. So just an important note that when you are using Git integration first time, the data is not going to be there. You're going to need to hit refresh. So that's pretty cool. I can actually use PBIP and DAX Query View to build my tests, to run those tests locally, to make sure my model's good. And I can also commit it to source control and just have my workspace pick up on those changes as I make changes. So that is the kind of DAX Query View pattern in a nutshell. And it helps build that safety net that you can run those tests locally and commit your semantic model with at least some peace of mind that your test cases are stored in your repository and you can run them at any time or have somebody else run them and at least have some peace of mind that you're not putting things in production that haven't been tested. So with about 10 minutes left, I want to maybe run through the next pattern for you, because if you've set up your testing and you've got Git integration, there's another level of automation that you can introduce to this, and that is the PBIP deployment and DQV testing pattern. So let's say if you don't use Azure DevOps or you're using GitHub Enterprise, you can actually still use PBIP, commit to your source control, and if you have access to GitHub Actions or you have access to Azure DevOps pipelines, you can actually deploy those changes using the Fabric APIs. And I have a template, which is on the QR code screen here, that you can leverage to get started in Azure DevOps. The idea is that when you make a change and you commit your changes to source control, it would look something like this. I'll go over the prerequisites here in a second. You would save to PBIP. You're going to commit that to Azure DevOps. And that Azure DevOps pipeline is going to run a couple things here. It's going to publish your semantic model changes. So it's smart enough to know using Git commands to figure out what has changed in the model or which models have changed and only promote those to your workspace. Then it's going to publish those report changes because those reports depend on the semantic models. Then it's going to validate the content by testing the refreshes. One of the things that is a test that I always recommend, bare bones, is you should always test to make sure that your data is refreshing when you push it to your workspace for the multiple times, because maybe the access levels that your developers have isn't what's in the production or the workspace settings that you have. Maybe the gateway isn't set up correctly. And so validating your test refreshes are good. And then finally, any of the test cases that are in your DAX Query View can be run using this invoke DQV testing module. Now I showed you how to run that locally, but we can leverage that same PowerShell module to run the tests automatically. And if everything is good with those models, it will push it to the workspace using the Fabric APIs. Now there is some prerequisites for it. You need DAX Query View testing, which I've already explained. You need Azure DevOps for this pattern. You need to make sure that you have XML and or service principals enabled, and premium back workspace. And for number 3, I just want to show you what I mean by that is you definitely need to make sure that you've got the XMLA endpoint turned on to read and write, because the service principal you're going to use to promote the stuff needs to be able to use XMLA to make updates, or use the API to make updates to the reports in the workspace. So it's an important feature. If you're not familiar with Power BI XMLA endpoints or setting up service principals, I know I don't have time to go into that today, but I do have a link in GitHub on how to set that up. And if you need to explain this to administrators, like tenant administrators, to how to set it up, there's a document on that. So if you have this set up, I have a example here. There is a set of YAML code that you can add to your pipeline. And this YAML code will run through installing the appropriate packages. So it needs the Azure accounts, it needs the DQV testing, and it also needs a PowerShell module that Microsoft has on their analysis services Git repo. Gentleman Rui Romano has authored a lot of this code, and thanks to him, this makes it a lot easier to run in PowerShell. This actually interfaces with the APIs, and with that, what it will do is run through loading your model, and I want to just highlight a couple things here. Let me just scroll down. There we go. This piece of code here identifies all the changes in your repository. So it'll actually look to see if there's been any changes to your reports or your semantic models, and then walk through the process of promoting those reports and the models. And then finally, near the end, it will run the tests. So right here, you're going to see this is running the refreshes, and this is running the tests. And what that looks like, act a little bit like a baking show. So we've set this up, and my instructions walk through how to set this up. This is a pipeline that has that YAML code running. If I click on that instance, you'll see that, oh, clicked on the wrong button there. You'll see it went ahead and figured out that semantic model has changed. It's actually identifying the parts of that model that have changed. Goes ahead and promotes it, issues a refresh, and then it runs the tests. And so these tests that you see here that are running should look very similar to the test cases that I ran locally. And so this is a good way to automate your testing. And then if everything passes, the pipeline passes. If it fails, I'll show you what a failure looks like. You'll get a message here at the top of the screen that says these are the errors with your tests. And then if you want to explore it a little bit further, you can also take a look at where in the model that test failed. So I know we got 2 minutes left, and I ran through that very quickly, but I hope you get an appreciation for why testing is important. And I'll try to open up to the questions if there is any.